Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of SchuBro's Unfiltered. Kyle and I are here with a special guest. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. This is Tifani Sadek.
And howdy to you, Kyle.
Howdy, everyone. How are y'all doing tonight? So, Tifani is a friend of a friend or acquaintance of mine that I know through my Texas A&amp days. And to give her a quick little introduction, she is a practicing lawyer and law professor at the University of Michigan, where she teaches entrepreneurship law. She has spent the majority of her career helping start and grow businesses, from opening mom and pop shops to expanding General Motors' connected car business worldwide. A first-generation college graduate, Tifani studied biology at Texas A&amp, whoop, law at University of Virginia, and management at Harvard. She is from Houston, but has spent most of her adult life in Chicago and Detroit. Tifani has been working since she got her first job at Chick Fil A at the age of 14, and she credits her mom, a single mother of four, for installing drive and strong work ethic. And Tifani, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I greatly appreciate you being willing to come on. I know that we...
welcome, Tifani.
I'll say, I know we had one of our other jackassery people on the other night, and Tanya. And when I told her that we had reached out to you, she just lit up with joy because she loves you so much. So I'm sure she's looking forward to this interview just as much as she was looking forward to ours with her. So I'm definitely looking forward to it.
And I listened to that one. It was really interesting.
Yeah. So Tanya or Tifani, I'm sorry, we keep two T names. It's going to screw me up. It's like when Russ and I are on together. It's Russ and Russ. So Tifani, I want to give you just a few minutes. I want you to, just open the floor and tell us more about yourself, and tell us, how you got to where you are, why you've worked the way you've worked, and what makes you want to keep reaching every day, and what makes you want to keep getting better and better and doing the things you're doing.
So I just love to learn. I've been curious since I was a little kid, I guess I could say. And as far as what makes me get up and keep going, I like to help people. I think that's at my core. That's why I like teaching. It's why I like law. I think I take things that are complicated and try and break them down and make them easier for people to understand, and at the same time help them. So, like I said, first generation student in every kind of way. Most of my family doesn't even graduate high school, so I've come a long way, and that's mostly due to just being a very curious person and having some perseverance. But I think honestly, every day I don't take anything for granted, and I'm really thankful for where I am, and I think that's sort of what keeps you going. I've taken, especially for a lawyer, a lot of risk in my career because I'm like, hey, I'm here, it could be a lot worse. So let's just see what else is out there. I'm not afraid to make some moves or jump around. Most lawyers are a little risk averse, if you know any lawyers, but I think that's what's made my career great and enjoyable, is that I'm willing to sort of try something different, try something unique, try something that just, maybe is not what I'm doing now, maybe something I've never done. And I think that's why I like working with entrepreneurs as well, because, they're definitely the same way. So I get a little bit of that from them.
So, in talking with you a little bit before we came on to record this show, you said that you considered yourself to be a liberal, but that, you also said that depends on who you're standing next to at the moment.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Just living, we're so polarized right now. It depends on where I am. Obviously in College Station, I would be considered a liberal. And then I moved to Chicago, where I actually registered as a Republican in Illinois because Chicago was a little too left for me in a lot of ways. And I think I found myself to be more of like a liberal Republican at the time. So maybe 2012, I think, is when I registered. And then I moved to Detroit, which is very similar to Chicago. And now I live in Ann Arbor, which is way different. There's a reason they call it the People's Republic of Ann Arbor. I mean, it is way, way, way left. So yeah, that's a lot of extremes. And so I think it's taught me that you're never something. Like, it's always in context in relation to something else.
Well, I think that's a great point, and I think it's important that we define each other as an individual. And,
Yeah.
I'm not a Republican in the sense that I vote for everything the Republican Party votes for. So, I mean, what would you consider to be some of more your, where do you fall that's more classical liberal, or maybe even today's liberal, today's left? And where do you fall that is, maybe considered today's right, or classic conservative, classic Republican?
So classic, I'm not a full, I was a biology major, not a political science major. So I don't want to use terms wrong. My husband was a political and philosophy major. And so he always corrects me when I use wrong terms. But, what most people would consider liberal about me is I have, I am not only comfortable, but I would prefer that government have a larger role in a lot of areas than my libertarian or conservative, like real conservative friends would want. Not only do I think there's like constitutional justification for it, I think the government can do better in certain areas than the private sector. And so I think that's what is going to make me liberal. I'm also socially pretty liberal. And in basically every way you can think of. Where I fall on the conservative side, one, most of my family is conservative. Most of my family is from East Texas. I went to a conservative college. I went to one of the more conservative law schools in the University of Virginia. And so I can empathize and see things from a conservative point of view. So when my friends at Michigan, we actually had a gun debate the other day, informal debate. And, when they just don't understand, for example, why someone would want guns or need guns or yada, yada, yada. And I mean, I get it. I was part of the gun and rod club at UVA Law. I've shot every kind of gun out there. I think they're a lot of fun. And not only do I think, they're fun, I think there's a constitutional right to them. And I support that the same way I support all constitutional rights. So that's a place I think, even if I don't agree politically with a lot of the right, in some circumstances, I understand where they're coming from. And empathize with it, and don't necessarily think it's bad or look down with it. I just disagree with it.
So, I just thinking of that, I got one question. So, I would assume that you didn't vote for Donald Trump in 2016.
Oh, no.
Okay. But of the current Democrat candidates on the primary, is there anybody on the left that would make you say, ooh, I may have to go vote for Trump?
There's literally no one on the left that could make. And I don't feel very strongly about anyone on the left, but there's no one on the left that would make me vote for Trump, or even stay home and not vote.
So even say a Bernie Sanders.
Yes, I would vote for Bernie Sanders if those were my two options. That doesn't mean I agree with everything Bernie says or wants to do. I think a lot plays into that. I don't think that he would accomplish a lot of the things he wants to do, which is a good and bad thing, depending on which policy we're talking about. So it's, I think a lot of what I don't like about Trump is not just his policies. There's a lot of other stuff. So I think I would just vote to get Trump out of office at that point, provided I don't think the other person is dangerous. And I just don't think Bernie in reality would be as dangerous as a lot of my conservative friends think he would be.
So
just like Trump, has been thwarted in a lot of ways. I think Bernie would as well.
So you think that the Congress and Senate being more right-leaning, well, at least the Senate being more right-leaning today, that he would have a hard time being able to push through a majority of his policies and in that case, be more of a figurehead than idea man than he in reality a policymaker.
Yeah, and I mean, look at Trump. He's had a hard time pushing through a lot of his policies that he wants to push through with a Senate and at one time a House on his side. So we're protected, I think, from some things.
That's an interesting perspective, especially, not especially, but because, of your background with entrepreneurship, I would think that, at least in my mind, that, you would want someone who's at least a little bit more pro-business and not pro government overtaking everything, but that's my opinion, and I'm not going to push that on you. But with that said, what is your thoughts on the fact that if Bernie were to get the nod, how would entrepreneurship be affected by that? How would entrepreneurs like myself and Ross take that? Would they slow down their on coming forward, or would they try to jump the gun and get stuff done now during the Trump legacy in the first year of Bernie before he could really get anything in place?
So it depends on what kind of entrepreneurship we're talking about. Like, I work right now, especially with a lot of really small businesses. I'm not working with the unicorns out in San Fran when I say startups. I'm working, with a 50 employees and under crowd. And honestly, I think I'm more focused on state and local politics for having those kinds of effects, good or bad, than I am at the national level. I haven't seen a ton of change, in the startup world at my level, whether it was Obama or Trump, with the exception of some Detroit-specific things that the Obama administration did. I don't see it coming down to that level. Tax policy, which I know maybe we'll talk about, can have that effect, but I don't see that effect trickling down to the level of entrepreneurship that I'm working with. It can have an effect on people's optimism or outlook, but I really think I'm a big proponent of state and local government having way more of an effect in terms of what your business can and can't do than I do the federal government.
Well, that's kind of an interesting statement, because I think most conservatives would espouse for more control to the state governments. The federal government giving each state government more control of themselves. And you just said that you would prefer the state to have more control there, but yet you said
I think the state does have more control. Yeah. And that's going to be one of the places I'll probably be less liberal than my counterparts would be when it comes to things like business. I see less of a role for federal government and more for state and local. Where I see government involved, like federal government involvement, are things like healthcare, education, things that can have sort of like a race to the bottom in a negative way. Business, the biggest effects that I've seen, big and or good and bad, are coming locally and statewide.
So, the argument there would be, we've seen state governments like Texas, where there's not no regulation, but there's a low amount of regulation, and business is booming in Texas, and it's been booming for decades, whether it's oil, whether it's healthcare, whether it's now the tech sector moving into Austin and Dallas, manufacturing in Houston. We have a lot of different infrastructure, whereas the cities you've talked about, Chicago and Detroit, which have had many, many, many decades of Democrat control and had these, more and more regulations, but they're not, that's not leading to business booming. It's not leading to economic growth. So, how do you square big government, but yet wanting to stay out of the way of business?
Houston and Austin are also under Democratic control as well. I think that's not so much necessarily tied to who's in power, and tied to a lot like Detroit, for example. If you want to talk Detroit, it's not the local government that's causing, or even the state government that was causing a lot of the decline that you saw in Detroit. So New York, San Fran also booming and also under Democratic control typically. So I don't think that's the end all be all in terms of okay, Democrats are in control, it's going south. Republicans are in control, it's going well.
Well, I would argue against San Francisco booming. Yes, there's the top 1% are, we hear the left consistently tell us about income disparity, but yet San Francisco is the poster child for income disparity. The highest rate of homelessness, homelessness is growing at a disproportionate rate. You need to make an average salary of $300,000 per year for a family to afford a median home in San Francisco. So, I mean,
it's got a lot of problems, yes.
So,
but in terms of business booming, there are a lot of startups coming out. A lot of the unicorns, those are the California startups. Is where they go. I worked for GM when they wanted to get into the autonomous vehicle business. They couldn't do it even in Detroit. They had to go to San Fran, and that's where their cruise business is located because, so. San Francisco is extremely liberal, but it's not stopping those businesses from being attracted to San Francisco or even growing and thriving there. But yes, all those other issues, a lot of those social issues, absolutely a problem in San Francisco and other big cities.
Well, I guess I would point to the 1950s and the 1960s, where the United States saw a very large amount of economic growth coming out of World War II. But yet our income disparity was almost negligible. Wages rose almost consistently across all levels. And I hear people on the left consistently tell me, I just want to get back to these levels of income equality. But yet that was the least amount of regulation we've had in the last 50 years. And it was in the 70s and 80s in which all these regulations really started becoming, where the EPA grabbed a lot of power and really started to tighten the neck on businesses. So, how do you square? Okay, yes, there is business in San Francisco, but all these big business, all these big government programs and policies in San Francisco are not helping with the homelessness problem. They're not helping with, people being able to afford to eat and people pooping in the streets and heroin needles being left out and all these other things. So it's great to have big business, but not at the cost of having rampant homelessness. Would you agree?
I would agree with that. I don't know that I agree that democratic policies are causing like that level of homelessness or drug use. I guess that's where I would disagree. I
would argue exactly that, because let's say rent control in California, which San Francisco's had rent control for a long, long time, has, the level of building in and around San Francisco, once rent control was instituted in the late 80s, early 90s, the level of construction plummeted and there's no new houses being built. So yes, the people who are in these rent controlled apartments, they're loving life, but everybody else can't find a place to live.
Yeah.
Because,
and
when you look
at go ahead.
I was going
to say theirs isn't working. Yeah, their policy, and I'm not familiar with what their rent control policy is. Theirs obviously is not working. I look at a place like New York, which does have some rent control. It's not as strong because there's still a ton of neighborhoods that get gentrified out. So obviously it's not working as well. But you don't also have that stop on construction that you're talking about in San Francisco either. And I think there are liberal policies that I don't agree with in how they've been implemented. What draws me to the liberal side is at least they're trying to tackle them and see them as a problem. One of the things that I hear, and I don't know that you all disagree with this, but that I hear from my conservative or libertarian friends is just that that's just the way it is sometimes, like we just have to accept a certain level of, homelessness or, people just not living in places, like, having the ability to live in places. And that's just the way life is. And that we have to accept that. And that's just, I think, where I start to break with my conservative and libertarian friends.
Well, and the funny part about that is the exact theory you're mentioning is Chicago Friedman economics. So we have in the United States, we have two prevalent economic schools. We have Keynesian and we have Chicago School. Well, Keynesian says the government should be involved in trying to keep as many people employed as possible, and they should fluctuate interest rates or put cash into the market to try to even, even out the lows and even out the highs and keep it in a nice steady middle. Whereas Chicago, which is 99% of Chicago policy, is adhered to by the left because it is more towards the socialist spectrum. But Milton Friedman, who wrote, basically founded the Chicago School, that was his argument, is that homelessness is not bad. Unemployment is not bad. It's a byproduct of the market, and people are going to be homeless. So it's, and we're guilty on both sides, right? People on the right who are typically more Keynesian, we adopt a few things from Chicago School, and people on the left who are typically more Chicago School, they adopt some things from Keynesian, where they nitpick, where they think certain theories work better for others.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I understand. I just think that's the whole point of having a civilization, right? Is that we come together and try and solve some of these problems. I think where I probably break with liberals is that I think sometimes the solution can be from the right, sometimes it can be from the left. More often I'll fall to the left. What bothers me is when people of either side can't say that there's, maybe something from the other side will work in this instant, right? Like there's always going to be your happy medium. In Detroit, in some places, I felt there was way too much regulation. So I would pull back there. It doesn't mean I'm for rolling back all regulations. It's sort of like in these circumstances, we need to move in the opposite direction. And I feel like you can't really, you can't advocate for that anymore. You kind of got to, like what we talked about in the very beginning of this podcast, you sort of have to have your stance, and you don't take context into account. And that is where I think that we're making a lot of mistakes.
So yeah,
well, I agree. Go ahead, Kyle.
I was going to say man, Ross, you got me. With the homelessness, there's two rules of thought. There's should the government take care of that, or should charities and organizations of that take control of that and help try to get people out of those situations? And I think typically the right is more of, I have no problem giving to charity. I will give to the charity of my choice. And I hope, those charities go into these, neighborhoods, and they help the people, they get them on their feet, and they get them back working, they get them back, into society, as long as they're willing to adhere to certain rules, like, no drugs, no alcohol, adhere to adhere to rules, adhere to regulations, bedtimes at this time. If you're going to be in one of our homes, you've got to, follow these rules. Whereas the liberal side is more of, let the government take care of it. Let's tax people more. And with those taxes, then we will use that money to better these people's lives, because we know best how to, get them out of homelessness. So I'm not saying that's 100%, always on the left, always on the right, but typically, your right people are more, hey, I'll donate to the charity. I have no problem donating, but let me donate how much I want and when I want. And the left is more like, well, let me take your money for you and let me put it to use the way I see fit.
Yeah, I somewhat agree with that characterization, in that I think both sides think that it's fine to give money to some third party that can take care of the problem. My friends on the right, that's what they always say. They're like, we'll just give to charity and they'll take care of it. My friends on the left, and myself included, my problem with that is, one, historically, that hasn't worked out for some groups, right? That's and with government, one of the safeguards there is equal protection. And that these should apply, benefits should be applied equally for the most part. And so that is where my concern with leaving it to people's goodwill and we'll just donate to charity. Historically, that hasn't benefited everybody. And right now it doesn't benefit everybody. And that's where I think we leave lots of specific populations really vulnerable. And that if we lived in a world where I knew that charity would be applied equally, I would feel very differently. But that's not how history has played out. That's not how the current world is playing out. So with government, that is the protection that I have, is that, at least in theory, and when it doesn't, we can fix it. It's supposed to, benefits are applied equally to all people. I don't get that same protection with charity.
So I want to, I guess maybe have a thought experiment real quick, because I hear people on the left, they constantly say, the government is the best way to reallocate these resources. And people on the right would argue, of course, no, they're not, because our government's not even efficient at allocating the resources they have now. So, this is a double-sided sword, of course. When Democrats are in power, like when we had President Obama, of course, the Republicans, the conservatives were up in arms and they hated everything he did. And all the money the government spent then was horrible and a waste. But now that it's Donald Trump in power, we're okay with a little more spending because it's for things we want. It's for things that we consider more important. So if you were to say, institute these policies at a federal level, which is the only way that this system were to work, because it doesn't, if each state was still allowed to do what it wanted to do, and the federal government, if you told me right now that we could get every state to just be able to make their decisions and the federal government stayed out of it, I would 100% support that decision. Then people who like the policies that California has can go to California and they can live under those policies. And the people who don't and they like what Texas is doing can come to Texas and live here and live under these policies. But, what the left is arguing is to make the federal government the purveyor of all of these policies so that they're nationwide, so that everybody falls into them. So if we were giving all this money to the federal government, and it was Bernie Sanders, and he was able to say, okay, we're going to pay for free college, we're going to pay for Medicare for all, and all these other policies that the left supports. You would be okay with that, correct?
Yes. Those are areas in which I feel the federal government should act. I don't feel that way about everything, but yes, those areas, yes.
Okay, so what if after 4 years, Bernie Sanders gets voted out, and let's say Candace Owens becomes president, and she says, well, I'm going to take all that money and now I'm going to go build a big wall along the northern and southern border because now I have all this money. Now the people are giving me all this money. Are you okay with that as well? Or
so I'm going to be a lawyer here and a professor, but it depends on what you're asking me. Am I okay with her having the authority to do that? Yeah, I acknowledge that part of the problem, when you give your guy the power is that the next guy or gal is going to have that same level of power. And that's, I am for pulling back executive power, I think, for that reason. So even within the federal government, I'm not okay with there being a ton of executive authority. I think the way we have it set up with Congress being the lead is the best. But, I think that is our buffer against a lot of the concerns that both sides have, especially when it comes to the Senate. The Senate is generally, Mitch McConnell has, a little bit of say in this, but generally, historically, the Senate is the sane one. And those protections I feel more comfortable with than when the executive has the power for the reasons that you're talking about.
So how do you feel about Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, who have both already said day one in office, they're signing an executive order, they're ending fracking in the United States?
I would want to know exactly what that order would say to understand where they're getting that authority from. I'm really uncomfortable with, Trump's executive orders. I was uncomfortable with Obama's executive orders for that reason. And I think that's where my frustration with politics comes in, is because we're okay with the ends. We're okay with the means if it's the right ends. And that's as I think I fall more liberal, but if I could really describe my politics, it would be, I would try to be principled. I think the principles are important. I think the rules and the laws and sticking to them are really important, and that's going to be our safeguard. So I get really agitated, even when it's my own side, when we go outside those rules and outside those safeguards, whether that's Bernie or Elizabeth Warren. Now, if I have to choose between Bernie or Elizabeth Warren overstepping their bounds with executive orders and Trump, I'm still going to pick Bernie or Elizabeth Sanders. I mean, those are my two options. But in a perfect world, I would have way more moderate of a candidate up there representing me.
So okay, so since you said that, of the current field of the Democrat primary, pick two. I'm not going to force you to say one or the other because I know there's a long way to go and nobody has completed their research. But pick two people right now that you would say are your leading candidates on the Democratic primary.
I mean, I took a quiz the other day of like which one do you line up with most, and I think it was Mayor Pete that I lined up with the most, and then Elizabeth Warren. So those would be my two. I don't feel like really enthusiastic about anyone right now. And honestly, I feel like I sort of represent most of America because I'm just in a crazy time in my life with, having a baby and a new job. And I can't pay the level of attention that I used to politics, even amidst all the impeachment stuff which, as a law professor, like that should be my jam. But I just can't keep up with it right now. And I feel like, okay, for the first time, I feel in terms of my engagement with politics and how I'm looking at everything, I feel more like the average American than ever. And I just can't make heads or tails right now because I'm watching the news through clips and bites and passing a TV in the mall or something like that and just like trying to gather it from there. And yeah, I'm not very excited right now.
So, okay, so you would say, but via your BuzzFeed quiz, you either line up with Elizabeth Warren or Mayor Pete.
I did one of the good quizzes. I picked a high quality political quiz, that asked like way too many questions. And I think I matched up like 90% with Mayor Pete. I was trying to figure out like where we differ. And I really couldn't dig in quite a bit, but I support things like government, healthcare. I support things like more money towards education at the federal level because I believe without it being at the federal level, there would just be a race at the bottom between like a lot of the states. So it's funny because you said people on the left think that this is the best form of government. I'm more one of those people that I think this is the least worst form of government is kind of how I look at it. It's just sort of, we've got to do something and this is the least worst solution that's out there. And that's really how I look at it. Because none of the solutions are great. I think I fall on the Democrat and liberal side more often just because at least our intent is the same, even if the method is not. So that's why going back to your question, that's why I consider myself a liberal.
So I'll stop Ross before he gets onto a rant about why he homeschools his kids when it comes to your comments on the education. My wife's a public school teacher, so I definitely would support the federal level and the state level more funding towards education because that is the role of the government. But I would want to put safeguards in that they have to remove all bias or at least attempt to remove all bias from the educational material and from teachers themselves. But that's impossible. So at least on the on the curriculum itself, at least try to remove bias there. As far as the healthcare goes, Ross and I are both veterans, and we've both had to deal with the VA at one time or another, and how poorly that organization is run. And that's supposed to be the best of the best for the few, the proud, the military elite, and I'm not going to say Marines.
USMCA, Kyle.
Yeah, right, exactly, Ross. So with that being said, I cannot back the government having any more control over healthcare because they've done such a shoddy job at the VA, which is supposed to only serve the small percentage of the people, and it's supposed to be the best of the best because those people gave gave a portion of their life to defend the country, and they can't have waiting lists that aren't at least 3 months long just to go see a doctor. So I really would argue that on that level, that needs to be privatized and more privatized and deregulated so that doctors can get back to doing what they're supposed to do, which is, help people instead of having to deal with Medicare, Medicaid, and all this other legal loopholes and rigmarole to try to be able to get paid. So that's my opinion there. But with the education, I do believe that the government should step up there.
I'm going to piggyback on Kyle just a little bit because we're starting to see an argument between the left, who argues about cost, and the right, who's arguing about quality of care. So like in the UK, in Denmark, and Canada, where we see these large government-run healthcare programs, their quality of care is very poor. Yes, they can go see a doctor, but they, to get an MRI, to see a specialist, to see any kind of, to get cancer treatments, their survival rates are very poor compared to the United States, compared to some other, not even first world countries. They have a lower survival rate when it comes to cancer or diabetes or other factors than we do here in the United States. And of course, there's very, very little medical innovation coming out of these countries. I mean, none coming out of Canada, none coming out of Denmark or Sweden or any of these countries. UK, we have a little bit, but I mean, 70% of medical innovation comes from the United States, comes from our system. So I just want you to, when you answer Kyle's question about, okay, if the federal government can't even run the VA for this 1% of the population, they can't even do that right, why should we let them do all the population? And then B, how do you square cost versus quality of care?
So with the VA, I agree. I don't think it's the level of care that we need to be giving our veterans. I don't look at that as the system that I want to implement. I think our healthcare, where it has been in government, has been patchwork. It's not been given the level of care and planning that it deserves. That doesn't mean that all government, federal, healthcare is destined to be that way. The U.S. is not great in a lot of these health measurements either. We have terrible infant mortality. We have terrible maternal mortality. We have terrible overall quality of health for Americans too. So ours is broken just as much. I hear a lot about Canada. I live really close to Canada. My husband's family immigrated from Canada. And it's interesting. I don't hear that from Canadians. I think I'm wary of statistics, right? Because I think they can, even my own statistics, they're terrified of coming to the U.S., like visiting and breaking an arm and having like a $30,000 bill or going bankrupt, getting hit by a car and going bankrupt. Like, it's funny, like we have our horror stories about Canada. They have the same horror stories about the U.S. Like, oh my God, don't get to the U.S. and get hurt. Like your life will be over. You'll be in debt, yada, yada, yada. I think there are good examples. I would hold the UK up. I don't think I never actually hear, it's interesting. I don't know why we don't hear that much about NHS, because the Brits like the NHS, they don't want, when asked about the American healthcare system, it actually came up very recently. It turned out, I don't know if you saw in the news that, in some of our trade talks with Britain, we were asking them to implement some similar laws that we have in terms of pharmaceutical patents and access to drugs and things like that. And Brits lost their mind. Like, even the right on the Brits were like, no, we're not going to touch NHS. Don't worry. We're not going to make it like the American system. We love our NHS. So I disagree that there aren't any good examples of government run healthcare. We don't have any here in the US. I honestly don't feel like we have adequately tried. I really don't. So I don't take the VA or even certain aspects of the Canadian system to be what we would have here in the U.S. If both sides came together and created some system together, I don't think that's what we would have.
So since you're a lawyer and you should, I'm assuming you would appreciate case law.
Yeah.
So in Canada, you had Chiuli versus Quebec, which is where a Supreme Court case came out, and the Supreme Court of Canada considered the Canadian healthcare system to be in violation of the Quebec Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. Mm-hmm. So the Canadian Supreme Court considers their own healthcare system to be a human rights violation due to the long wait times and due to the disallowment of private insurance in the face of these long wait times. And, there's I would argue go watch some Steven Crowder videos because he's Canadian, or he was raised in Canada. He went to Canada to try to get some health care because he was told it would be free, and he took a video of it. And you can watch the video for yourself, but I'll just say he did not receive care in any type of expediency. And the reason his family moved back to the United States is that his mother contracted a disease, and basically the Canadian government told her, we're not going to treat you. So her dad moved back into Detroit so that she could get care with private insurance. So
yeah, and if you're lucky enough to have private insurance, you're going to get better care in the U.S. You know, you mean if you can pay for it, if you have a way to pay for it, you can get better care here. But that's why I would prefer a system something like the UK has, where you have this robust, NHS, and then you can also allow for private insurance. I think something like 10% of Brits have this additional private insurance if they so feel like they need it. I don't know if the 90% doesn't have it because they can't afford it, the private insurance, or because they don't feel that they need it for, their basic healthcare that they get every day. So I have a similar discomfort with like a single payer system. But that's not the only other option. And we're not even having that discussion. We're just having, the worst of Canada or the worst of the US. And that's kind of the only two options that I ever really see discussed in the national sphere.
In your opinion, did healthcare get better or worse after the ACA passed?
More people have healthcare in ways that it personally affected me. I honestly didn't see much of a difference. I know my mother-in-law is a small business owner. She has insurance for the first time because of the ACA. This is all anecdotal. I honestly, I can't. This is a situation where it's hard for me to make heads or tails because it's so politicized. But I think the fact that when Republicans said they were going to take it away and their own constituents freaked out on them, I think that says a lot.
So, I mean, anytime we try to take money away from people that's been allocated to them from the government, they argue, regardless of who they are, right? Everybody wants that. And I made that point earlier that, Republicans, when we're getting the money, we're all for it. And Democrats, when they're getting the money, they're all for it. But the problem is that, we're $22 trillion in debt. So where do we square our national deficit in terms of the additional spending that would be required for, say, the Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders plan?
I mean, could stop a lot of the wars that we have. I mean, that takes up a lot of money. I am not a proponent of more spending is better. Like when it comes to education, is you mentioned like you all mentioned you're for maybe more federal funding in healthcare. I'm not necessarily thinking that throwing. And this is where we can talk about Detroit, because a lot of what I saw with Detroit wasn't more spending that made things better. It was being more creative with solutions. I mean, funding was a huge part of it. Don't get me wrong. Detroit needed more money, but it needed to be creative as well. And part of that creativity was business. Part of the creativity was government too. And that's where that you saw the government step in and actually help a lot there was with the creativity. So when it comes to something as big as like healthcare and education, I think I see it usually like, okay, this is what healthcare costs right now, multiply it times this many more people, and that's what it's going to cost. Same thing with education. I don't know that that's necessarily going to be the case, that it's just multiplied by the cost that we have now. I don't know that it will go down as much as like a Bernie says, but I don't think it's going to be as costly as it is now, especially education. Listening to your podcast with Tanya about the education bubble and how subsidizing education did make things more expensive, and I agree with that. I think we need to fix a lot of that before we talk about expanding education, or at the same time we talk about expanding education to everyone and taking it back to actual, education that we're paying for, and not, like Tanya said, the lazy pools that go across campus and the 27 deans of life and things like that. It doesn't have to be as expensive as it is, and we need to be having that conversation as well. Okay,
so let's pivot. You brought it up in Detroit. So can you give us a kind of a quick synopsis of what happened in Detroit and what was done to slowly bring them back from the brink of disaster?
Yeah, and I mean it's still coming back. But I moved to Detroit in 2012, a year before it filed bankruptcy. And I think a lot of people know the story of Detroit. It was this booming manufacturing capital, riots, army marching through the streets, white flight. Now everything's terrible, right? Burned out buildings. And that's some of that is true. A lot of that is not the whole picture. There's a lot more to its decline than that. But I'll talk about the comeback. So in 2013, it filed for bankruptcy, which most people, I think, thought was a bad thing. It was heavily contested in Detroit. It's still very painful for a lot of Detroiters to talk about. But for me, maybe because I'm a lawyer, I thought bankruptcy was a good thing because it's what it needed to do. I think Detroit didn't have an income problem. It had a debt problem. And I think 70 cents of every dollar it brought in was going to pay off debt. And there's no city, I don't care if you're left or right, Democrat or Republican, that can live off, only keeping 30 cents of every dollar that you bring in. So a big part of Detroit's comeback was discharging its debt. The bankruptcy judge was very creative in how it did that, so that it wasn't just a matter of slashing debt. Like, for example, Detroit would trade riverfront property in exchange for letting go some of the debt. So everyone tried to walk away, with as little pain as possible. But where I think Detroit has really come back is, one, we started electing more responsible politicians. I use that word responsible loosely because there's still scandals, in Detroit. It's mayor's under a scandal right now. It's always under a scandal. But we have really, our mayor, despite his scandals, is an extremely good administrator. And what I think he did that helped Detroit was he recruited some of the best and brightest minds to come to Detroit and apply creativity to solve problems. A lot of them were younger people trying to get their start, maybe in, some type of municipal planning or government or whatever. And he would basically say, come here. I know you're not going to stay forever, but I will give you so much latitude that you're never going to get in any other city. And you can be creative in your problem solving to address this problem. And that attracted a lot of people. And I think you started seeing some creative solutions come out in Detroit. And that's where, government came into play. Because a lot of Detroit's problems aren't sexy to fix, right? There are a lot of systemic and structural issues in Detroit that need to be fixed before you get to, the fun stuff like planning city parks and things like that. We have a lot of issues. And then you also saw you saw the government working really, really closely with philanthropy and business, and getting businesses up and going. Also working with the big businesses too.
When you say
everyone did heavy lifting.
When you say the mayor told business people he would get out of their way, is that saying that he removed some regulations that would prevent them from being able to start businesses, or is that saying he just didn't enforce those regulations, say, for a 10-year period? Or, I mean, specifically, what do you mean there?
Yeah, so he recruited people inside city government to come be creative and problem solve. And it wasn't necessarily, it was like, we're not going to get any more money. The money we have is the money that we have. I can't give you more money. How can you solve these problems? I'm going to break free of a lot of political norms and maybe even take some heat if some of this goes south, but be creative in how you're going to be solving these problems. Bloomberg from New York and the Obama administration, instead of necessarily sending more money, they sent a lot of talent to Detroit to embed in city government as well to help be creative and creating policy, scaling back where we need, creating programs where we needed. And that is what I think has helped Detroit get out of its funk. Like I said, we can't throw any more money at the situation. And I don't know that, and that really helped me see that throwing, you don't have to throw money at certain situations. Sometimes it's being creative with what you have and being able to embrace different ways of doing things. I don't think most cities have that latitude. No one's going to let you do things crazy. Detroit was already so broken. Other cities, if it's not broken, don't fix it. So they're not going to get creative with things. But Detroit's like, oh gosh, we're so broken. Just try something. Just try anything. And we'll keep what works and we'll discard what doesn't and just keep trying. And you just saw all of these people coming from all over the United States, from other city governments coming in, being like, okay, I'm going to make my mark in Detroit. I'm going to have this once in a lifetime chance to have some latitude and creativity that you usually see in maybe entrepreneurship. It was maybe applying a little bit of an entrepreneurial mindset to government. And in this case, I think it worked pretty well and is still working pretty well.
So I want to warn you, because if anybody else listens to that, they're going to think you're fairly fiscally conservative, because you hit some very fiscally conservative notes in that last little bit. You said, it's not about an income issue, it's a debt issue. And fiscal conservatives, myself, that's exactly what we argue. It's not about income. The country makes $3.65 trillion a year in tax revenue. And I will say, since the, Trump tax cuts, we've actually gone up $0.3 trillion a year in tax revenue. That's IRS actual numbers from the IRS. So, I mean, we're collecting more tax revenue than we were before the tax cuts. But that's an aside. But it is a debt issue. There's only so much money, and once you're out of money, you're out of money. So you then sought other outside the box solutions that didn't require spending money. And I think a lot of fiscal conservatives, myself right now, I've got a lot of policy proposals I'm putting in front of congressmen that are outside the box policy proposals, that are things that, hey, let's try this, because, and Kyle can vouch for me, I preach incrementalism, which is, government is designed to move slowly. It's not designed to move quickly.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
And so, but on a fiscal side, I argue when I talk to the Republicans, because, Republicans are a all or nothing bunch most of the time. They want everything right now the way they want it. And, it's like, ending abortion. They want to completely wipe out abortion right now, but it's not going to happen. We're never going to get the votes for that because of the filibuster. So we're not going to be able to cut massive amounts of spending without cutting some of our own desired spending. Does that make sense? So
yeah, that makes sense.
So I argue, okay, we want to cut, or we want to add stipulations to entitlements, to SNAP benefits, to Medicaid benefits, to Medicare benefits. But the Democrats aren't going to vote for that, because every time we say that, it immediately is countered with, we'll cut defense. Well, I agree we should cut defense. We spend 2 times as much money as any other country in defense. We spend twice as much money as China in defense every year. So I definitely think we could cut defense by 10, 15% and still be the world's leader in defense spending. Things such as, and what I make arguments for is that we don't need more equipment. We need better people. We need to be able to recruit software engineers. We need to be able to recruit coders. We need to, the military battlefield does not look the same as it did in 1942. So we have to change our mindset there. But, still, it's a debt issue, not an income issue. Right now, we spend 9% of our federal budget on paying interest on our debt. That's 9%, almost, and it'll be 10% next year. We'll spend 10% of our federal budget, which is more than we pay for the VA and all government employee retirement benefits, by the way. We spend in interest. So
that is crazy.
So you said earlier, well, we could end some of the wars. So I wanted to point out one thing there. I said I would rebut you on where I could. We spent $4 trillion on the Iraq war over 12 years. Is that a statistic or a number you agree with?
I don't have it in front of me. It sounds like it would be right, though.
Okay. Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders medical plans would add $4 trillion a year to our federal spending. So what we spent in 12 years in Iraq, they would spend per year just in medical spending, not in education, not in any other programs, just in medical spending. So how can we square it's a debt problem with the level of spending that they're trying to get to?
So it is a debt problem. Like I said, Detroit did need more money, but simply throwing more money wasn't going to solve it. And I think that's the case with healthcare too. I believe that adding healthcare for everyone, I believe that we can do it. I think we need to have that same kind of creativity. And I think that's where I think that Warren and Bernie and their plans probably wouldn't be implemented in the way that they're talking about being implemented. And that's when I say they're saying these things, because they may believe in them, but that's what people, my liberal friends I see, they want these things and they're not thinking about it critically. Do I think it will actually be implemented in that way? Maybe not, and probably not, almost certainly not. But do I think it's an important issue that they'll push and maybe Congress will finally act? That is where I think Warren or Bernie could have some impact that I would agree with, as opposed to most of my libertarian friends just don't think that we should have government healthcare. I mean, my true libertarian friends is just like, that's just not a place government needs to be acting, period. We just don't need to have it. I can't agree with that. I also can't agree with everyone is just, we can afford to give everyone Cadillac healthcare, because I don't think that's possible either, especially with as unhealthy of a population as we have. And that's where the creativity comes in. And like in Detroit, Detroit had to tackle some of its healthcare costs, and some of that was as easy as something simple like getting women to carry their babies all the way to term and not have babies born early that then needed NICU stays. They focused on getting women to keep, make their date is, hashtag make your date. That's what you saw all over Detroit. Something as simple as that didn't take a ton of money, and it can save healthcare cost quite a bit. I think we need to all agree that this is an issue that we need to tackle, which we don't all agree that providing healthcare is an issue that we need to tackle. But to get things where if it were my perfect world, we would all agree healthcare is an issue we need to tackle. And we would look at things like that. Like, what are some of the ways that we can be creative about bringing down these healthcare costs? And also, how can we provide like a basic minimum level of healthcare for everybody in the U.S. so you don't have people, suffering and dying from something that's pretty easily remediable.
Would you agree? I'm sure when you studied management at Harvard, you took an economics class.
Yes.
Did you study
microeconomics?
So you may not. Did you study debt? Did you study dead weight loss?
Not so much. I can imagine what that means just based off the term, but it would probably be better if you explained it to me.
So basically, dead weight loss is any loss to a system, to an economic system, due to a tariff or a tax or anything else, because what that's doing is it's shifting away from the equilibrium. So anything when we look at it, we take the point of supply and demand, because we say, well, with the tax, the new cost is X, which means the demand is here and the supply is here. So if I were to draw a line down and draw a line back, I can calculate the area, and that's the amount of money that's pulled out of the economy because of that loss. Yeah. So what I'm alluding to here is additional government regulations, additional taxation tends to not equalize the society. It tends to drive up costs for the consumer. So I guess to me, in an economic sense, when I look at wanting to add more regulation, wanting to add all I see is the price tag going up and up and up for the consumer, for the end consumer, because even, in the ACA, the cost of healthcare went up when we started subsidizing education, as we talked about with Tanya a couple weeks ago. The price of healthcare started rising, the cost of education started to rise way faster than the normal cost of inflation. We see in Venezuela where they instituted a lot of these policies, and it was 1,000,000% inflation. And, Kyle and I both have people in our lives that are from Venezuela that are very good friends of ours. And we hear these horror stories every day that, you talk infant mortality rate, their infant mortality rate is through the roof because the hospitals are closed. The doctors have left the country. So, we see where in Canada, there's not enough doctors. We see in in England, there's not enough doctors. And in almost every other country around the world, there's not enough doctors. Yet in America, we have, in most small towns, we have at least an emergency room or, a urgent care type clinic. So
yeah, I mean, yeah, we're facing some of those problems too. I mean, if I understand correctly, we have a doctor and nurse shortage. We import a lot, and I know in Detroit and not just Detroit City, Detroit Metro Popular, we have to import a lot of those from Canada. That's who's coming across the bridge every day to come work, or people in the medical field, because we are facing a lot of these issues too, and it's not necessarily because of the type of system that we have. I think there's a lot of other things that play into that. And I agree with you. I think if you start just directly injecting a ton of money from the government, it's only going to drive cost up.
Okay,
I don't know that I feel the same way about all regulations necessarily. I think the government can still provide some pressure or some support in a lot of ways that don't have that same effect. I think of I actually, in a lot of ways, I like some of the things that Texas as a state is doing, like in education, for example. I think I don't know that we're going to have time to talk about this today, but like the top 10 rule, I think that's great. I think that's something that others, I'm like, why don't other states do something like that? I don't think it's produced as much of an effect as people thought it would, but I think it's a step in the right direction. I think Texas, I don't know if this went through, but they were talking about students are going to have to start graduating in 4 and 5 years. Or you had like the 10, I think they pushed away from that, and I understand why. But the $10,000 degree, if you complete your degree in 4 years and don't languish around, things like that is where government, I think there's some of the more creative ideas. I don't know if they solved all the problems, but Texas seems to be thinking a little bit outside the box compared to other states, at least that I've lived in. When I ask people, how does their state approach this or that? So I agree with you. And just if we're just like, hey, write a check, which is a lot of what I hear on the liberal side. More money, more money, more money. It will solve the problem. I don't think that will solve the problem. Lack of money does cause problems. So I think you need to get to a certain level where something is well funded, and beyond that, we need to start being a little more open-minded and being a little bit more creative in tackling problems. The answer is not always money, money, money. And I think this is where I start too. When I said, depends on where I am, like I wasn't as liberal as people in Chicago and Detroit, definitely not as liberal as people in Ann Arbor when it comes to like fiscal policy and spending and things like that. That's where I start to break away. I probably want to spend more than my conservative and libertarian friends. Like I think we need, maybe some things aren't funded enough, but throwing more money beyond what it actually takes to operate isn't going to give us better results. And I acknowledge that.
Okay, Kyle, I'm going to apologize. I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to hand it over to you for a little bit. I know I'm asking most of the questions.
I have a great two-part question now, but I'll let you get your one question in. Tiffany, only spend 30 seconds on it, though, because I'll probably forget my questions.
So write them down, Kyle, because she's going to spend more than 30 seconds on this. So, Tiffany, I actually have a healthcare proposal, which I think meets some criteria of what you're saying, and it meets a lot of criteria of what the right wants. And I'd be interested, you said earlier, we need to get proposals from the right and from the left, and we need to evaluate those critically. So would you be willing to hear my proposal and critically give me a synopsis of what you think of it quickly?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what I see the problem in healthcare is, and I see it as an economic problem, it's that we have given all of the power to the insurance companies. We have ceded as consumers all of our power to them, that we have now enrollment windows. We can only enroll during this period of time in the year, and we have to pick this plan. And our companies choose, for the most part, if you work for a corporation or a company, they choose who your healthcare provider is going to be, and you have to pick one of their plans. And so, you might get 2 to 3 plans to look at, but then you have to pick one of those. You're stuck. What I'm proposing is in one part that we go to like Texas does auto insurance. So you're familiar with how Texas does auto insurance, correct?
No, I've been gone for a while. So if it's different than it has been 15 years ago, then I don't know. Not
really. The state imposes a minimum amount of insurance that every person must have to drive a car. Mm-hmm. But then they're free to go to any company And that, those companies know, okay, I have to provide at least this level of insurance, and they're free to go to whichever company they like and price comparison shop. And, if I'm with company A and they decide to raise their rates, then I can cut my policy off today and I can go to company B. And so it drives competition amongst the companies to provide A, better quality of care, and B, to lower their prices, to be more competitive in their pricing. So what I'm suggesting is that, number one, we allow states, not the federal government, to dictate minimum levels of care on health insurance. So every state, whether it's California, Michigan, Texas, Florida, New York, whoever, gets to choose, in their state legislatures, what is the minimum amount of care that each insurance policy must have for that state, for the people in that state. Number two, employers are not allowed to contract out to one insurance company. Instead, when you sign your job offer with them, so we have the ACA marketplace. It exists. Whether I like how it's currently used or not, I want to modify it to where when you get employed by an employer, in your employment offer, they tell you, we are going to offer you X amount of money per month for your health care. Then, once you're enrolled, instead of going to their company's website that then takes you to their healthcare provider, you go to the ACA marketplace, where you can then choose from any of the providers on the ACA marketplace and choose your insurance for yourself. Now, all of those insurances in the state of, say in Texas, would have to meet the minimum level for the state of Texas. So you start there, that's your cheapest plans, and then you can go up based on what you think you need in your life. And of course, we need to have some educational materials associated with that so people are more familiar with what type of insurance they're getting and what they need to have covered and so forth and so on. But then this makes the insurance companies more competitive. That makes them require them to offer better care and to lower their prices. And secondly, what I also want to add to this is that I can change my insurance at any moment for any reason. That if I don't like company A, that I can cancel my policy and start with company B in the middle of the year at any point in time. That's my right as a consumer to then choose who I do business with. So could you give me some thoughts on what you think that plan would do for us?
Yeah, so I think that's definitely an improvement over what we have now. I agree with you. We've ceded control to insurance companies who have a profit motive that makes me uncomfortable. The more money they save on our healthcare, like the better their profits are. And so I don't like that. So I think from that perspective, it is better. My concern would be one, people that are just more expensive to insure. I don't know how we help with that, right? Like how do we make sure that, old people or sick people, for example, are covered? And second, it's interesting. One of the reasons I like decoupling healthcare from employment is I find healthcare is a huge inhibitor of entrepreneurship. It's one of the hardest things people have to grapple with when they want to leave their employer and start their own thing is what the heck am I going to do about health insurance? And so in hiring people, it's, dealing with benefits like that. It inhibits people from hiring people. So part of the benefit I see of completely decoupling health insurance from employment, which it's odd that it's coupled in the first place, is that I think it actually would free people up from, having to work for large employers. I mean, that's what happened to me, honestly. I had my own practice. I was an entrepreneur. I knew I wanted to start a family, and I'm like, I don't know how I'm going to do this on my own. I need to go to a big employer that has better healthcare because I don't know what's going to happen when I have a kid. I don't know what's going to happen health wise, and fearing the worst. Like I would rather have the security of a big employer's benefit package. I think a lot of entrepreneurs think that way. I hear it all the time dealing with my clients. So I think what you're proposing is better than the situation that we have now. Absolutely. But those are sort of the concerns that I would still have with something like that.
So what if I told you that we already have the solution for disabled people and elderly people? It's already there. The government already has it in place.
So you would keep that?
I would keep Medicare and Medicaid, but for anybody who's working. Now, I've also called for limits on eligibility to Medicare, not to Medicaid, of course. If you're disabled or you're elderly, then you've earned your benefit. Then we'll take care of you. I do believe there is room for a limited social contract theory, but I don't believe that people who are able-bodied should be able to live off the government due to unwillingness to work, which I think we've incentivized. So a lot of my proposals, and I have a lot more, but we won't get into that because I promised Kyle some time here. But I have a lot of, but everything I want is to incentivize people to work, incentivize innovation, incentivize and give people the freedom to go out and have the opportunity. So it's about equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome.
Yeah, and I think in theory that's great. In a place like Detroit, where people don't even have access to jobs, people that would love to work, they can't. That's who I stay concerned about. That's who I consider part of the vulnerable population that I don't want to, I pay a lot in taxes. I don't like the idea of someone just sitting at home who could otherwise work. At the same time, I recognize that we're never going to have 100% employment. It's never going to work out that way. We're always going to have people that are looking for a job or people that can't work for some reason, not just because they're elderly or disabled, but just something is going on, like we see in Detroit quite a bit. I still would want to provide for people like that. And I think that's like the people that I think are left out of the policy, but it is definitely better than where we are.
So I definitely have more questions here, but Kyle, I promised you time, so I'm going to shut up for just a few minutes.
Well, I'm going to ask a question that's not one of mine based on that last statement. You said in Detroit there's people that want to work but can't. Can you kind of expound on that? What is the situation there that precludes them from being able to work?
So one of the reasons I got into entrepreneurship in Detroit is that I saw it being a way to get people out of poverty and to get people back working. So part of the problem is people live in Detroit. There are not a lot of jobs in Detroit. I would say, I think the statistic I saw is there's probably a third of Detroiters that don't have access to a car. Like, not just don't have a car, don't have access to a car. There's terrible public transportation. Most of the jobs are outside the city. So there's been push to get some type of transportation. It's failed. I think it's literally been voted on like 40 times. It's constantly just failed. You have these situations of people that are like, I would love to work. Where should I go and what should I do? It's not as easy as just leave Detroit. I mean, people's entire social support systems are in Detroit. It's all they know. They literally can't get up and just leave. That's where I find fault with a lot of sort of market-based solutions of like, oh, people will just move. There are transaction costs, right? Like there's friction there. It's not that simple. So, let alone Detroit's educational system, which doesn't prepare people for the workforce when you have a 50% literacy rate. There are people that otherwise would want to work that can't. And that is what drew me to entrepreneurship, because empowering people to start businesses that can in the neighborhoods, they hire their neighbors. They hire people in the neighborhood. They hire people in places where people can walk to work. And that's what we've seen in Detroit. That's been a huge part of its renaissance, is helping people start businesses, because they hire people in their neighborhood. They hire people like them. And so that is sort of the situation we would see in Detroit, where you had able-bodied people that would otherwise work that literally can't.
Now, Detroit didn't do anything stupid like Austin did and try to make Uber and Lyft illegal, did they?
So Detroit was a libertarian's dream when I got there. I mean, there were regulations and like nothing was enforced. So no, there were no regulations against Uber and Lyft. I mean, Uber and Lyft didn't want to go to places in Detroit like that, right? Like they're like most of my Uber and Lyft drivers in Detroit came in from the suburbs and were terrified of Detroit. Like it was funny. I mean, it was just funny. Every time they picked me up, they'd be like, "You live in Detroit? I thought I'd be taking you to, one of the suburbs." I'm like, "No, this is where I live." So the market didn't work there, right? They wouldn't go out. I think the city wound up having some type of agreement with Uber and Lyft that they wouldn't exclude places in Detroit. I don't know how that's working. I mean, drivers can always cancel, right? So no, it was never banned. They're alive and well.
Okay, because I know like Austin, they banned it because the taxi organization.
Yeah.
Now
Austin,
that got repealed at the state level, but it it was in place for a while. All right, so I wrote down some of my thoughts.
I remember seeing that. I remember my friends my friends being rightly angry, and that was Uber's. I always was sort of like, what is their poor general counsel? I mean, their whole MO was to just operate illegally until the public demanded that their representatives will allow them to participate. So it was very interesting. But when I moved here, I always said Detroit was a libertarian. Like you could do anything you want. Like cops couldn't. I mean, in a good and a bad way, right? Like you saw a lot of crime. You also saw a lot of cool things and creativity happening because you could just do whatever you wanted. Nobody would do anything about it. So Detroit operated that way for quite a while. It's having to relearn to respect authority, I think, in a lot of ways, Detroiters.
So I wanted to go back to something you said earlier real quick, because you talked about Houston and Austin being very liberal cities within Texas, which of course there is some truth to that, but they also are very limited in how far liberal they're allowed to go by the Texas state constitution, with our, balanced budget amendment, where they can't spend more money. They have to put out, they actually have to tell taxpayers how much they're going to pay before so that stops them from getting, and then also the homeless problem in Houston and Austin is now exploding. We have the governor of Texas almost daily tweeting about how bad Austin's homeless situation is, and where there's literally camps under the I-35 bridges, and he's threatening the mayor of Austin that if he doesn't get this cleaned up, that he may have he may move to have the state take control of the city of Austin. So yes, Texas has liberal cities, but number one, a lot of their policies are smoothed out by our own very conservative, very fiscal constitution. Secondly, even still in those cities, these policies are still showing the same economic impact of more homelessness, more income disparity, more people not able to afford their rent, more people not able to afford food. And then third, these businesses are no longer moving into Houston or Austin. They're moving into Round Rock, Georgetown, Bastrop, Katy, Sugarland, Conroe. They're not moving into the inner city because they don't want to pay the taxes, the property taxes that the inner city has implemented, because that's the one place Democrats have been, or the liberals have been able to go and make headway, is with property taxes. So these companies don't want to pay those. So Google, Samsung, Motorola, name any other tech company that's moved to Austin. They're not in city of Austin. They're not within the city limits. They're in Georgetown. They're in Round Rock. They're in Pflugerville. Dell. They're not. They're up in Round Rock because they know that those cities, those smaller towns, even though they're still very big to where Kyle and I are from, or even where you're from, those are going to give them lesser property taxes, and they're going to give them a better shake. So, I mean, think about Detroit. I was in Detroit this summer. I came up there to do a job, and there's some very nice parts of Detroit, and then there's some very, very bad parts of Detroit still.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So, I think what we've seen actually whether liberals want to admit it, a revulsion back to some fiscal conservative policies. Now, with still some socially liberal ideals, but like you said, it's not an income problem, it's a debt problem. And so they pulled back their spending, which is a conservative ideal, whereas liberals tend to want to increase spending. So, but we're still seeing the businesses in Detroit, like you said, they're not in the city of Detroit. they're in the suburbs of Detroit. Even the airports are in the suburbs. Even, most of these auto manufacturers are in the suburbs. They're not in city of Detroit. They're outside of Detroit. Now, Detroit benefits from that, but they're not benefiting as much as they could. How do you see that?
I mean, they're benefiting from Detroit. Otherwise, they wouldn't even be near the city, right? Like, they're all trying to get as close to the city as possible without being in the city to save as much tax dollars, as possible. And I agree, there's a trend for a lot of companies to do that. I don't know that trends are always reflective of like, I look at trends, but I'm not like, that's the end all be all, because they're always moving, right? Like, for a while, everyone was moving up north and now everyone's moving down south. Like, I don't necessarily like look at there's companies moving to suburbs, so therefore the suburbs are, must be doing something right. There's still a lot of big companies that are operating quite profitably in cities. I mean, probably more than not. I think, yes, maybe if you had and some are picking up and moving. They're moving from California to Texas. And then there's lots of companies that are starting to California. I think, movement is not always like, I think it's easy to point at some movement and being like, haha, they made this decision. That must be, this must be the right way of doing things. There's still a lot of companies that are opening up in cities too, and a lot of companies that are staying put in cities and not deciding to move. I think each company is going to make, different decisions based on what kind of people they're trying to attract, what city they're going to, how close can they get to the city, and not quite be in it. All of those factors, come into play. But at the end of the day, they're not moving to Lufkin, Texas. They're moving as close to Austin and as close to Houston, as possible. It's still the city that is attracting them, right?
Well, it's not the city that's attracting them. It's the population. It's the availability of employees. The more employees they have, the less they have to pay them. I mean,
but those people want to be near the city. Like, if you open Dell in Lufkin, you're not going to get the same people. Like the city, that's incumbent, I think, on the city to attract the people. I mean, that's why New York can do what it does, because there are people that will not live any place outside of New York. Already, it's a lot of people consider it the only like real major urban city in the U.S. And it can do what it wants to do and still attract certain companies because those people want to be there. I don't know that. I think a lot of cities try to do that. They try to attract the people, and the businesses go where the people are.
Okay, so I'm going to counter that with Midland, Texas.
SpaceX.
Mm-hmm.
Because why would anybody want to move to Midland, Texas? Sandstorm.
I don't know a lot about Midland, Texas, to tell you the truth. Tell me about it.
So Midland is, semi-arid. A lot of sandstorms. It's really hot when it's hot, and it's super cold when it's cold. When we do get rain, it's usually hail and tornadoes.
Mm-hmm.
But yet, Midland is the epicenter of the Permian Basin, the largest oil reserve in the continental United States, or in the United States, even outside of the Alaskan play. So, even including the Alaskan play. So, one of the highest median incomes in the United States. Okay, so I live and work in Midland. Do you know how many employees in my office? We have about 300 employees in my office. Do you know how many of them are native to Midland?
I would doubt most of them are not.
3.
I would say most of them probably are not.
1%. 1% of our employees in my office are native to Midland. We've got guys from India, France, Venezuela, Cameroon, Nigeria, South Africa, England, Wales, Denmark, the Philippines, China. We've got people from everywhere working in this office, and they come here because the money is there. Now, not everybody moves there, of course, but I argue that yes, if money is in a specific place, people will go. The gold rush of 1849. Why did people brave the trails to go across the Rockies to get to California? Because of the promise of the potential promise of a better life. Why did people leave Germany and Ireland and Italy to come to the United States? For the possibility of a better life. It wasn't promised, it wasn't guaranteed, but the possibility existed. And people believed in that possibility enough that they were willing to get up and move. People such as yourself. So you're from Lufkin. Kyle and I are from Dimebox. So we've got you beat when it comes to
She's not
small
actually
town.
from Lufkin. She's from East Texas.
So actually, Lufkin is the biggest nearest city. My family is from Diboll, Texas. If anybody knows where that is,
I was in Diboll working on an oil well about 6 weeks ago.
Oh my gosh!
Yep.
I don't know if I've met a lot of people that even
Well,
have heard
we
of
have
Diboll.
because being from
Diboll
Dimebox,
and
we get confused with Diboll all the time.
Yes. And we're, pretty close to Highway 21, both of us. So, so I argue that mobility, yes, for some people, mobility is a serious issue because they have family ties or other things. But like myself, I moved from Dimebox to Midland for a job. Kyle, he moved from Dimebox to College Station. You moved from Lufkin or Diboll to now you're in Ann Arbor. I mean, it's not that it's impossible. And it's whether you think the risk is there. So that leads me to the next thing I wanted to ask, which is, which do you believe is better? Freedom of choice or guaranteed outcome?
Ooh.
And that actually leads into one of my questions I wrote down earlier.
You can't ask lawyers to answer definite questions like that. That's really hard for me.
The whole point of having you on here was to put your feet to the fire and ask you very specific questions that really. So Kyle and I would both be considered. I don't consider myself a Republican. I consider myself an independent who caucuses with Republicans. I'm like Bernie. I caucus with a party, but I'm not.
Yeah.
I'm not that party. I'm a constitutionalist, which means I break on some very big things, such as allowing trans people to be trans people, allowing homosexuals to be homosexuals. I believe in a closed door society where I shouldn't care what you're doing in your house. You shouldn't care what I'm doing in mine. As long as I'm not violating anybody's constitutional rights inside my home and you're not violating anybody's constitutional rights within your home, then you do you and I'll do me and we leave each other alone.
Mm-hmm. It's funny. I would consider myself the same. I think where we differ is probably in our interpretation of what Constitution allows. But that's maybe a different subject. But yeah, no, I agree with that. I guess I would probably say the thing that makes me love our country. I would probably opt with freedom of choice. I think I would rather. Yeah, if I had to choose between the two, I would choose freedom of choice. I can probably give you 50 different caveats to that, but I won't. So, feet to the fire, yes, that would be my choice.
Okay, so that leads into one of my questions.
Go ahead,
finally, Ross. That leads into one of my questions from earlier, and I did write them down because Ross took the mic back yet again. So individual liberties when it comes to vaccinations. We're seeing a very large, well, not very large, but we're seeing a small but growing contingency of people who are anti-vaccination and that nature. But when we had mandatory vaccinations at the government level, we eradicated certain diseases. And because of this small but growing population that are against these vaccinations, we've actually seen, measles come back. We've seen, other, diseases that were considered eradicated come back. So, being that, that's your individual liberty is to choose if you should or should not be vaccinated. Where do you stand there, as wanting because if we do mandate and truly mandate vaccinations for the government level, which would then increase the greater good for everybody. Now the cost of healthcare is lowered because now everyone's at least got the base minimum healthcare in the vaccinations. That's. Where do you stand there? Should that be mandated at the government level, or should that be something that's an individual liberty?
Yeah, this was a hard one for me because it also, we're bringing up like protecting the children, right, versus parental rights, and as a parent, like that one's hard for me. Where I would fall is I would not support government mandated vaccines in terms of like everyone must be vaccinated. But if you want to go to school, I think you absolutely I don't believe in like waivers and your kid can still go to school. You're putting everyone else at risk at that point. So I think that would, put some natural societal pressure. And I think a lot of more people may opt to do it and feel that they're still making that choice. There's choice, and sometimes choice is an illusion, right? But I think actually, I don't know that I could support everyone must get this vaccine. I think that goes too far. Like to live, you must have this vaccine, or to not break any laws, you must have this vaccine. But I'm totally fine with okay, if you don't get this vaccine, then your kids can't go to school.
So where do you fall then? Where do you fall then on religious exemptions?
I would fall the same way. That's fine. You have every right to practice your religion. I think it puts, public kids, other kids at school, it puts them at risk. So those two, we start to bump heads against different rights. And that, I think, the kids' right to be healthy outweighs the risk to religion, because you're not saying they can't practice their religion. They still can. They just won't have access to school.
You're about to get canceled because most of Islam does not believe in vaccination. And so, I mean, we argue for the death that, we can't restrict somebody's right, unless they're Christian, of course. We can't restrict their right to access to a government program due to their religion. So how do you square then, say, people of the Muslim or Mormon faith, or even the Jewish faith, who have certain criteria they're not allowed by faith, but yet you're saying we should be allowed constitutionally to restrict their access to government programs?
I think if I would fall back on if there's some type of rational tie, if it's okay, you can't have, welfare or something if you don't have vaccinations. To me, that makes no sense, right? That, I think, is punishing someone. I think there's a very rational reason for not allowing unvaccinated children to attend school, and potentially bring these diseases to other children, some of whom can't. If you have a medical reason you can't get a vaccine, you're allergic to them, that's different, and we need to protect you. That's where I start to break from my more liberal friends who do see it more the ends kind of justify the means there. Okay.
So
I would be totally fine with schools saying with us being you can't go to school here if you don't receive these vaccines, because it's the health of our children. But I also this one's really, really hard for me. And I also have to take into account that while we are seeing a resurgence of these, diseases, they're still relatively rare. My mind might change, on these things. It's all context, right? My mind might change on some of these things if things change. But right now, it's got to have a rational, to me, supporting constitutionality, it's got to have a rational basis. And I think protecting other school children is a rational reason, a very strong rational reason, versus saying like I said, you can't have welfare if you don't get your kids vaccinated. That I wouldn't agree with.
Yeah, that's one of those hard hitting questions that it's
It's really hard.
Both of us have struggled with that question.
I really want to say everyone needs to vaccinate their kids. I have a good friend who's an anti-vaxxer, and she honestly believes it's not for a religious reason. She honestly thinks she's making the best choice for her kids. She really does. This is a hard one. This is really hard.
Yeah, it's something that both of us have struggled with because we are very individual liberty people, and I'm of the opinion that the herd immunity has to be kept high in order for it to be effective. So because of that reason, I would say it be mandated, especially for public schools. And there could be a argument for, they're getting cut off from government funds. They're paying into the government. They're paying their taxes. So potentially you could say, we could create a smaller sub school for them, but that's throwing money at something that doesn't necessarily need to be thrown at. But I'm gonna move on to my next question. So you said that you're seeing a lot of Canadian doctors and nurses leaving Canada to come to Detroit to be medical professionals there. Was that correct?
Yeah, like they live in Canada still, but they work in Detroit. Like my birthing team, both of my babies, like all my nurses were Canadian.
Okay, and is the reason that they're coming from Canada to Detroit to work is because when healthcare is considered a right, therefore it's mandated that they either have to, pretty much, and I hate to use this term because it's something that's taboo, but they pretty much become a slave to the medical field. So they either, all that time and effort they spent to become a doctor or a nurse, now they're akin to a slave in the medical field because, their labor is, considered a right. So everyone is entitled to it, and they're not really allowed to make decisions that benefit them because now they have to perform that care, or they have to switch an industry. And this, all that time and effort and all that money they spent on becoming, especially a doctor, it's just thrown out the window, and they have to switch industries to something that they think they can actually make money at.
So I don't know that they're coming to Detroit because they're like, I don't want to work in Canada necessarily. I look at that more of like, we have like such a shortage here. There's obviously still a ton of doctors and nurses that do work in Canada. I don't know that they're necessarily like, feeling like they can't, or maybe I misunderstood the question. Are you saying their work is devalued in Canada because it's seen, because it's considered a right there, so they would prefer to work in the US?
Not just that, but in Canada, there's a limit to how much money they can make because of the fact that it's a mandated right to the people of Canada. So if they're going to work in Canada, their salaries are going have to be capped. Otherwise, the government's not going to be able to afford health care to all. So if they want, and then yes, even though they're making a wage, is it a living wage? Is it enough to benefit them to the point of, I went to school to become a doctor. I spent 8 years in school, and I racked up, let's say, $250,000 in debt. Well, now because the government has put this mandate on it, they're only able to make, let's say, $70,000 a year, which is still a good salary, but it's not nearly what they could make if they came to Detroit and worked there. So, they're almost akin to a slave to the government system.
That's becomes part of the problem that I have. Yeah, that's part of the problem I have with a single payer system. I think that's true. I also think that I still think that if doctors didn't have the educational debt that they did, and still made, I think you would still make like good money, even under a Canadian system. I still think that would attract people. Is it as good of a proposition as coming to America and like being some kind of thoracic surgeon that makes $1 million? No, it's not. But is that still, across the board, maybe it's still a better system? Yeah. I still think so.
Okay.
So I guess a question there is, why did you become a lawyer?
Because I like to argue. I became a lawyer, honestly. I like to have these thought exercises, right? I like to think things through and make arguments. I just enjoy it. So did potential income ever cross? Was that part of your decision making process? To some extent, like I said, I was raised without money, and I think for some people that can drive them to want to make more money. I also recognize like I was fine without it. And so I'm not really driven as much by like as much money as I can possibly make. But to your question, most like if I knew that lawyers came out and made 20, 30,000, I probably wouldn't have, pursued law school.
Well, that was going to,
I definitely wouldn't have taken on the level of debt that I did. Definitely would not have taken on the student loans.
So this is where I come back to freedom of choice versus guaranteed income or guaranteed outcome. Mm-hmm. Because you had a freedom of choice in going to college, A, paying for college, B, choosing how much college to pay for. Nobody put a gun to your head and forced you to go to Texas A&M, which is a more expensive university, or Virginia, which is a more expensive university, or Harvard, which is the most expensive university. You chose that. That was of your free will, correct?
Yes.
I mean, no, I'm pretty certain nobody forced you to go to Harvard, right?
No.
Okay. So, I mean, where does it become between, so if I'm forced to, in my tax money, pay for everybody else's college education, do I any longer have the choice to pay for a college education, or has my choice been removed? I'm paying for a college education regardless.
You're paying for a college education regardless.
So is that freedom of choice, or is that guaranteed outcome?
It's not freedom of choice. No, I would agree that's not freedom of choice. And this is a place where I would not choose freedom of choice. The same way I wouldn't get rid of K through 12th either. You know, that's also not freedom of choice, and I still think that's the right outcome. So
where do you fall? I got two questions, and I'm bouncing around which one I want to ask, because one's going to leave this topic, and I want to. This is a great topic, but we spent a lot of time on it. Okay, I'm just going to go with this question. Where do you fall on school choice? So I'm a big proponent. My kids are homeschooled, but I'm a big proponent in school choice, that your area code, your zip code should not dictate what schools your kids are allowed to go to. If you pay taxes, your kids should be allowed to go to whichever school you then choose. And I understand this is going to mean some crashing of some schools and some emptying of some others. But I mean, even in states where, like California, where we fund public education K through 12 at an exorbitant rate, teachers make, the most money, but they're 48th in the nation in test scores. So you said it earlier, throwing more money is not the solution to the problem. So, what is the solution for me is giving the consumer, which is us, the taxpayers, more choice, freedom to say, no, that school sucks. I'm not going to go to that school. And I'm not going to have to pay a transfer fee because I live because I was born in this area code or this zip code. And I think you're starting to see the African American community buy into this, because they're saying, you know what? That seems fair. Why should I have to go to these crappy inner city schools and send my kids to these crappy inner city schools? Because this is where I was born, and I don't have you mentioned it. It's hard to move, but yet we've seen the left. We've seen Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Amy Klobuchar, Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg come out very staunchly against school choice.
So we have school of choice in Michigan. You can go. You're not bound by that. It's absolutely wrecked Detroit. It's been awful in practice. This is one of the things I think my conservative and libertarian friends. It's good in theory. It does not work out well in practice. It's absolutely wreaked havoc in a bad way in Detroit. And that's why Michigan is so strongly, Detroiters especially feel very strongly about Betsy DeVos, because she played a big role in this. So, so I would support school of choice with some parameters. I think you still need to have some level of local government say in these schools. And here's why. In 1 year, Detroit had 90 schools open and close. 90 schools in Detroit open and close. You can't stabilize a city. You cannot stabilize a neighborhood. You can't attract people when you have schools opening and closing left and right. This city has no say in where these schools go. So in the nicer areas, they have maybe 5 or 6 schools to choose from. In the poor areas, some of them, there's like one school in like a 10-mile radius. There's just it's chaos.
Well, wait just a second, because I want to clarify something. You're saying schools opening and closing. Are you saying public schools, or are you saying charter schools?
No, charter schools. There's a ton of charter schools. So there's a ton of charter schools in Detroit, and private schools. There's a little bit of everything. It's really just absolutely chaotic.
School option. I mean, private schools, I can already send my kid to whatever private school I want to send them to, regardless of area code, zip code, right? It's just about money at that point. I'm not talking about that. I'm only talking amongst the public school system, allowing kids. So that's what we're trying to do here in Texas. That's what we want here in Texas, is that you can send your kid to any public school. And in that case, the municipalities, the school districts, have control over those schools. So that
that's something I get, as long as there's some type of control, not for the sake of having control, but to be able to plan out the city and neighborhoods and things like that. Schools are a huge part of why people move to where they move. So If it's in the public school sector, then I would feel more strongly. It's when we start talking about charter schools and not having any type of governmental control. It's been an absolute disaster in Detroit.
So you just made an important point that goes towards school choice, because you said schools are part of the decision of why people move where they move. So richer people, wealthier people will move to areas with better schools. And then what happens is those areas get more businesses, get more jobs, get, better income. So the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, right? Because then the poorer districts are left out in the cold. All those businesses that were in those poorer districts move to the richer districts. And that's why we see this gentrification. These districts are constantly changing. So by allowing school choice, you're now saying, no, it doesn't matter where you live. You can send your kid across town. Now, it's, we're not going to bus your kids in. The school is only going to bus within its district. But if you're willing to drive across town, if you're willing to drive across Detroit to go to a different school to drop your kid off, then your kid can go there and you're not having to pay transfer fees or out of district fees or whatever else.
Yes, I see what you're saying. We have that here in Michigan. We have it in Ann Arbor, and a lot of people use it, and people are okay with it. There's different schools. Detroit does that. There's, Montessori type schools. There's immersion schools. People will, all these being public schools, and people have the choice to send their kids where they want. I think it can still, hurt. Like Detroit, for example, has the biggest school system in Michigan, and it's still, I can't remember the number, but it buses so many kids leave the city of Detroit to go to other schools, and that's not going to help make Detroit schools better, right? Like taking those students and those resources out. So I think you still have to have some way to stabilize inner city schools, so you don't just get people to bail. Like we need to somehow stabilize them. But I think keeping it at least within the public sphere, most of the school choice policies I see allow you to use it for private schools and charter schools as well. I think it's more palatable to keep it at least within the public school system. And that's the kind of compromises I wish we could make.
So here, now I will say this: do you want to see rich people all of a sudden start supporting inner city schools? Crash their schools with inner city kids. Slam their schools with inner city kids. Go from their schools where the class sizes are 15, 20 kids per class to being 30, 40, 50 kids per class. And all of a sudden, those people will say, you know what? I don't think it's such a bad idea. I'm going to make the choice to support those inner city schools a little more so that these kids will go back and my class sizes go down. I'm willing. So for me, it's a trade-off, right? It's going to take some time. And I'm a long-term economist, which is why I'm an incrementalist. I don't believe in big changes overnight. I believe change takes decades to occur. And we see that whether it's a social change, whether it's a financial change, whether it's, any type of change in this country, it takes decades to occur. But I think if you said inner city mothers, you don't like where your kid goes to school. They've got class sizes out of the known. They got teachers who don't care. Let's send those. You can now send your kid to any. So you send your kid to let's say what's the school I'm looking for? Houston Cashmere, and their academic record is very poor. But now Katy is only a few miles down the road, and you can send your kid to Katy without any issues whatsoever. You know what the people of Katy would be more willing to do for Houston Cashmere?
Yeah, you make it their problem. Yeah, absolutely.
So I think the system we have now, the system that the left is advocating for, is, to me, it's more racist than the system the right is advocating for.
I think if you didn't advocate for that plus fixing the inner city schools, I would agree with you. But for most people I know on the left who advocate for forcing people to go to their school in their neighborhood district for the reasons I said, to stabilize those neighborhoods, it also comes with the caveat that, like, okay, let's also just fix that school, not just force people to stay there.
Well, I'm about freedom of choice. And when you're freedom of choice, that means you have to be freedom of choice for everybody. You just can't be freedom of choice for yourself. So like I've always told Kyle, right? We lead very different lives. And I've always told Kyle, look, I want you to live your life the way that makes you happy. And you don't need my approval. You don't need me to say anything about it. I don't have to agree with it. Do what you want to do. But I expect the exact same level of respect from you. And this is what I go back to my closed door society viewpoint. But what we do by forcing you to go to this school, again, it comes back to economics. We're telling a consumer they have one place to go shop. And that place to go shop then has no competition, no reason to better its services, no reason to make itself better, no reason to do anything. And these other schools where these people love what they have no reason to change what they're doing because they have it what they want. So you get screwed and they get everything they want. But yet when we hear the conversation of race and racism, we constantly hear the left accusing the right of being more racist. But I would argue that by forcing a family to be dictated by the zip code they were born in, that you're saying these inner city schools, which are predominantly minority, that you're going to maintain the status quo by keeping these minorities in their area and not allowing them to grow educationally, which is not going to allow them to grow financially, which is not going to allow them to grow economically. Because, an old saying is rich people are rich because they spend money like rich people. You can give a poor person money and make them rich, but they're not going to change their spending habits and they'll soon be poor again. I mean, what do you think about that?
So the whole treat everybody the same is great if we actually treated everybody the same, right? Like we have to acknowledge or maybe you don't, but I acknowledge institutional and systematic prejudices and biases that are in the system that doesn't make it as simple as give everybody the same and everything will shake out just fine. If you open up, Woodlands high schools to kids from Houston ISD, the kids from Houston ISD aren't going to make it out there. It's another thing that I see my conservative friends talk about that in theory, yes, I can see that working if there's no friction, no transactional costs. In practice, no, that's not happening. I mean, we have this here in Michigan. You don't see, you see some kids getting up outside and leaving Detroit, which destabilizes the local schools. But most kids, like I said, people can't even get to work. They're not going to be able to get their, kids out to the great suburb schools. One thing you mentioned that I thought was interesting is it sounded like in your policy proposal, there would not be a limitation on the school to accept these kids. And I think that would kind of change the dynamic a little bit. That's not the way you really see it out in practice. In Michigan, schools don't have to open up. They can choose to. And the really good schools don't. Schools like Ann Arbor, which is super liberal, but the kind of liberal that practices what they preach, they do open up their schools, and they really do want to have kids from surrounding communities that don't have access to Ann Arbor schools, even at the whatever expense that is. They welcome that, and that's one of the things I do love about Ann Arbor. But in practice, you generally it just doesn't actually work out that way. And then that's my problem with a policy like that is in theory, but in reality, we have all these structural barriers that don't make it work out well.
So I want to say this, we're going to have you come back because we have a lot more topics we wanted to cover and we just haven't been able to get to them. Now, this has been a fantastic conversation, I believe.
I really enjoyed it. And it's funny. We're more similar than we think. I think it shakes out differently based a lot on our personal experiences, to tell you the truth. But it's been a great conversation.
Yeah, we didn't even get to Texas A&M football, Ross.
Oh gosh.
Okay, so I did that on purpose. I did want to go one last little thing. So you mentioned from the outset, I asked you, is there any candidate on the left that would even give you the thought of voting for Donald Trump? And so I've wanted to ask this the entire conversation. Could you tell me a specific policy? Because you said it's not specifically about policy. You just don't like him.
Well, it's not that I don't. It's not that I don't like him, but yes, it's not just specifically policy, because policy can be fixed.
So, okay, name me a specific policy from Donald Trump that you have an inordinate amount of disdain for.
Most things related to immigration, but what really bothers me, what really makes me say that there's almost nobody the left could put up that would make me vote for Trump. So I'm very influenced by a recent book I read, which was Democracy by Condoleezza Rice. And she writes about her experience and what makes democracy hold up as she's seen them build up and fall apart in other countries. And the main thing she said was the strength of the non-governmental institutions, or not non-governmental, but like your media, your courts, all of the institutions, not just non-governmental, but all of the institutions are what prop up democracy. As they've seen democracy fail in other countries, it's because they didn't have these institutions. And what concerns me about Trump is the constant battering ram against institutions that are holding up our democracy. And once you break that trust, you can't get it back. So whatever policy is implemented properly at a government level can be fixed, can be undone for the most part, unless it's, that's the way our system's designed, right? Like de Tocqueville said, the great thing about America is her ability to repair her faults. When you have the public start to lose faith in our institutions, unduly lose faith in our institutions, that to me is really harmful and dangerous. And that is what I don't like about Trump. Most of his policies, a lot of them are painful. They're painful for very vulnerable people, and I don't like that. But the other part is what I think can't actually be fixed. So that's why it would be hard to find a policy that would drive me away from voting for whoever the Democratic nominee is.
I promise you we're gonna wrap this up, but I do want to is there any policy Trump has gotten passed in his 3 years that you do like?
Yes, the criminal justice reform I think was excellent. I thought that was good. And whenever I see anything he's done that I disagree with, I try to look further. And some things he's done that I don't like the outcome, there are reasons I agree with. I'm trying to think of something he did. Some of the environmental regulations that he's rolled back, I don't like them. But when I read the reasoning, I'm like, okay, these weren't done, I think, in the proper way. And yeah, because I think if we just get it's easy to see. If we get a Democrat back in there, we can do it the right way. So there are some things he's done that I like, but there's too much.
What we're doing right
wrong.
now is wrong. We're reducing emissions faster than any other country in the world. Why we've every
do you
member
think
of
that's because of Trump?
I think that's because of innovation. I don't
think that's because of Trump, though. I look at things like the automakers trying to roll back emissions on their own and getting sued for antitrust. But he's pretty hostile to environmental regulations. He's pretty hostile to even legal immigration. Those are things I can't get behind.
So he's not hostile towards legal immigration. No.
I think looking at his policies and talking to immigration attorneys, even legal immigration is being scaled back. And if you look at remarks by Stephen Miller and his former advisor Steve Bannon, like you'll see why. And you'll see that you'll see where it's coming from. Like
he just made one of the largest
legal immigration.
He just made one of the largest expansions to the H-1B program ever. That was a Republican driven mandate. They increased H-1Bs by a huge amount, but bigger than anybody's ever done. They brought in more H-1B visas and opened up more H-1B visas, and plus opened up a direct pathway from H-1B to a green card. No other party had ever done that. That's the first time that's ever been done.
And H-1, yeah. They also changed the way that they apply H-1B, and I think it would be great to have a further more in-depth discussion on this. But that is also just one point, like in the grand totality of our of how we've approached immigration, legal immigration as well. And then, like I said, you can go look at the remarks of Stephen Miller and Steve Bannon, even about legal immigration. And they don't see it necessarily, legal immigration, as a good thing for America right now, and have talked about their plans to scale it back.
Okay, so we're going to table the conversation, but a couple things now that I want to bring up in our next interview when you come back, which I hope you will.
Okay.
Number one, I want to talk about immigration versus wage growth.
Okay.
Because there's a very economic way to say that unlimited immigration, whether legal or illegal, when we see the left say, well, wage growth is stagnant. Well, yes, because we're flooding the labor market. So we'll talk about that next time. We're not going to, we're not going to get into that tonight because we're coming up on 2 hours. But I want to talk about that. I do want to talk about the growing Brexit movement. And we were, I was hoping to get to that tonight, but we didn't get to it. And then, of course, Kyle, I know we need to talk a little bit of Aggie football, Aggie basketball, other Aggie related things. Shockingly, we're going to talk about.
Hey, it goes to your incrementalism stuff, so
all right, that
it makes
good.
sense to talk about it since you love to preach incrementalism. Aggie football, Aggie basketball. That's you got to talk incrementalism when you talk about those sports. So,
Aggie football took an incremental step backwards.
No.
Okay. That they lost more games this year than they lost last year. So yes, factually, I am correct. Okay, so we're gonna get done for the night. I appreciate you very much, Tifani, for being here, and I appreciate the conversation. I think it was a very good conversation. I think we had a great time. I hope you don't feel that at any point we tried to attack or gang up on you. We definitely wanted to give you an opportunity to speak your mind and say, but also counter it with where we believe and see where the commonality lied. And I think we found some commonality through civil debate, which is always a good thing.
Yeah, I agree. We should run everything, right? We would get it
exactly.
right.
Well, I think that's the issue. That's why I like freedom of choice. Let everybody decide for themselves. Let's break it down to the lowest levels possible. Let's get government out of people's lives as much as possible. Break it down to the local, the federal should be basically out of everything except running the military, foreign diplomacy, and a few other things. They shouldn't be involved in education. They shouldn't be involved in healthcare. They shouldn't be involved in any of these things because 90% of our congressmen are not most of them are lawyers, but 90% of them are not college professors. 90% of them are not doctors. 90% of them are not farmers. So they shouldn't be making decisions for the people who are.
I would 100% agree with you if we could make sure that we got rid of a lot of systemic and structural biases that are in the system that prevent it from actually being a level playing field if you absolutely gave everyone freedom of choice. And I would love to talk about that next time.
So let's put that on the agenda for next time as well, because I have some research on systemic bias that is a little counter to yours. But we definitely thank you very much for coming on and spending time with us. I definitely 2-3 weeks down the road want to have you back, give us all some time to decompress, but definitely, would you be willing to come back and talk to us again?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It was fun.
Put a gun to her head, Ross, and ask her. Okay. But I do want to thank you, Tifani. It's, like I said, it's been a great conversation, been a great time. Definitely would love to have you back and maybe even have Tanya come in as well. That would probably make a great conversation. Luke would probably hate us for having to have four audio forms, but oh well, it'd make for a good show. So I definitely thank you. I'm a bit out. Gig 'em and God bless y'all. Have a good night.
All right,
Gig 'em.
guys.
Bye.
So Tiffany's out. Everybody, thank you for listening to us today here at SchuBros Unfiltered. We'll be bringing you more special content like this as much as we can. And thank you for staying around and listening to us. And hopefully you like the content. Give us a like on Twitter, Facebook, wherever you find us. Listen to us on SoundCloud. Tell your friends. Let them know we're here. Thank you so much for listening and have a great night.